By early May of 1945, the war in Europe was visibly collapsing. The German army no longer fought as a coordinated force, but as scattered remnants clinging to roads, forests, and ruined towns. General George Smith Patton's Third Army was moving with relentless speed through Central Europe, driving eastward as if nothing could stop it. In just 3 months, Patton's forces had covered more than 600 miles. They had crossed the Rhine River, shattered German defenses in Bavaria, and were now deep inside Czechoslovakia, pressing toward Pilsen and the road to Prague itself. The advance felt unstoppable. Fuel depots were full. Morale was high. The enemy was broken. To the north, General William Simpson's Ninth Army had already crossed the Elbe River near Magdeburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin. To the south, Patton's armored columns were pushing into territory that Soviet forces fully expected to occupy once the war ended. Everywhere, German resistance was crumbling. White flags appeared on rooftops. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength or the will to resist. The road east lay open. Patton believed the moment demanded action. Soviet forces were still fighting block by block in Berlin. American armies had momentum, speed, and overwhelming air superiority. Why stop now? Why slow down when they could occupy as much territory as possible before Germany formally surrendered? Every mile taken now would determine the fate of millions after the war. Patton looked at the map and saw opportunity. He also saw danger. The answer to his questions arrived not from the battlefield, but from headquarters. It came directly from General Dwight David Eisenhower. The message was short, direct, and absolute. All American forces were to halt at pre-designated stop lines. No further advances into territory assigned to Soviet occupation zones. Simpson's Ninth Army would not move on Berlin. Patton's Third Army would stop short of Prague. The orders allowed no interpretation. Patton did not merely disagree, he was furious. He stared at the map and saw what he believed was a crime unfolding in real time. His tanks had fuel. His men were ready. Intelligence reports showed the enemy was finished. The Red Army, exhausted and bloodied, was still fighting for Berlin. Patton believed his army could reach Prague within days, perhaps even challenge Soviet positions farther east if allowed to continue. Instead, a piece of paper signed months earlier was acting like a brick wall. To Patton, the order did more than stop his advance. It protected the enemy of the future. He felt like a racehorse being pulled back inches from the finish line. He demanded answers. Why were they stopping? Why were they allowing Soviet forces to occupy Prague when American units could arrive first? Why were they handing half of Europe to Joseph Stalin without a fight? Eisenhower's response was calm but firm. The decision was not military. It was political. The matter had already been settled. In February, the Allied leaders had met at a conference. Agreements had been signed. Occupation zones had been drawn. Spheres of influence established. Eisenhower told Patton the orders were final. American forces would halt exactly where those agreements required them to stop. Patton's reply was immediate and blunt. If that was the case, then the president had given it all away. Eisenhower did not deny it. He only repeated that the decision stood. What Patton did not know was that the agreement stopping his tanks had been negotiated 3 months earlier by a dying president. It had been kept secret from the American public. Even the Vice President of the United States had not been told the full truth. In early February of 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived at Yalta, a resort town in Crimea, to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The conference was meant to decide how the war would end and what Europe would look like afterward. The American public knew the meeting was taking place. They did not know what Roosevelt was about to concede. Roosevelt was gravely ill. He suffered from severe cardiovascular disease. His blood pressure was dangerously high. His hands shook visibly. His face was gaunt, his voice weak. He struggled to stay awake during long meetings. Stalin noticed everything. Across the table, the Soviet leader saw not a rival at the height of power, but a man nearing the end of his life. Each tremor of Roosevelt's hand, each moment of fatigue, signaled weakness. Stalin understood opportunity. Churchill saw it too, and it horrified him. This was not the Roosevelt he had worked with for years. This was a man who should have been in a hospital bed, not negotiating the future of the world with one of history's most ruthless dictators. But Roosevelt insisted on handling the negotiations himself. He sidelined his own State Department. He dismissed Churchill's warnings. He believed he could manage Stalin personally, charm him, persuade him into cooperation. The conference stretched over 8 days. Roosevelt met privately with Stalin multiple times, often without Churchill present. Concessions were made that Churchill did not learn about until afterward. Decisions were reached that would shape Europe for nearly half a century. Almost all of it was kept secret. Stalin arrived at Yalta with clear demands. He wanted control over Poland. He wanted influence across Eastern Europe, including Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. He demanded occupation rights in Germany. He wanted everything the Red Army occupied at the end of the war to remain under Soviet authority. Churchill objected immediately. Britain had entered the war to defend Poland. The Polish government in exile was based in London. Polish forces had fought alongside the Allies from the first days of the conflict. Churchill insisted Poland could not simply be handed to Stalin. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. He argued that Soviet security concerns had to be respected. The Soviet Union had lost tens of millions of people fighting Germany. They deserved a buffer zone. Churchill, Roosevelt said, needed to accept reality. Churchill warned that accepting Soviet domination meant betraying millions who had fought for freedom. Polish pilots had flown in the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers had fought at Monte Cassino. What message did it send to abandon their homeland now? Roosevelt brushed aside the concern. Stalin, he said, had promised free elections in Poland. Democratic governments would be allowed to form. The war had changed Stalin. He was now a partner in peace. Churchill realized he was losing. The American president held the power. American industry funded the war. American armies dominated the battlefield. Roosevelt made the decisions. Churchill could protest, but he could not stop what was unfolding. Hidden within the agreements was a secret protocol. It was not shared with Congress. It was not revealed to the public. Even Vice President Harry Truman did not know it existed. The protocol divided Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria would fall under Soviet control. Hungary and Czechoslovakia would be under dominant Soviet influence. Germany would be divided into occupation zones, with Berlin deep inside the Soviet sector. In exchange, Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. He promised free elections in Poland. He promised cooperation with the United Nations. Roosevelt believed he had secured a fair deal. Stalin gained security. The United States gained help against Japan. Peace would follow. Churchill knew better. He had dealt with Stalin long enough to understand that promises meant nothing once Soviet power was secured. When the conference ended in mid-February, Stalin returned to Moscow victorious. Churchill returned to Baitu, London, knowing Eastern Europe had been sacrificed. Roosevelt returned to Washington and told the American people the conference had been a triumph. In early March, Roosevelt addressed Congress. He sat while speaking because he could no longer stand for long. His voice was weak. He praised the agreements as a foundation for lasting peace. He spoke of free elections and cooperation. He said nothing about the secret division of Europe. Reporters asked questions. Roosevelt deflected. Details were still being worked out, he said. Stalin had been reasonable. The alliance was strong. Congress believed him. The nation trusted him. But Roosevelt knew the truth. He knew Stalin would not honor his promises. He knew Eastern Europe was lost. He also knew he would not live long enough to face the consequences. Just over a month later, Roosevelt was dead. When Harry Truman became president, he inherited not only the war, but secrets he had never been told. As he began reading classified briefings, the reality emerged. Agreements, promises, boundaries already drawn. When Truman saw the maps, the meaning was unmistakable. Berlin, Prague, Vienna, gone. American armies were not liberators racing toward freedom anymore. They were approaching the edge of a cage already built months earlier. On the battlefield, none of this was visible. Patton's men still stood ready. Engines idled. Crews waited. The war could still be shaped by movement and force. But decisions made far from the front had already decided where those armies would stop. Eisenhower had received his orders earlier in the spring. Allied forces were to halt at lines based on occupation zones agreed at Yalta. Berlin was not to be taken by Americans. Prague was off limits. Political agreements overrode battlefield realities. Eisenhower also feared reports of a supposed German national redoubt in the Bavarian Alps, where fanatical Nazi forces might make a last stand. Intelligence suggested prolonged resistance in the mountains. Because of this, Patton's Third Army was turned south rather than east. The fortress never existed. By the time the truth became clear, the Soviets had already moved in. Patton watched it happen. He watched opportunity disappear mile by mile. He watched history lock into place. And as May progressed, the full cost of stopping became impossible to ignore. The story was far from over. As the days passed in May of 1945, the consequences of the halt orders became brutally clear. American armored columns sat idle, while Soviet forces surged westward into territory that American soldiers could see but were forbidden to enter. Roads that Patton's tanks could have crossed in hours were now being sealed off by political lines invisible on the ground, but absolute in command. The war was ending, yet the future was already being decided by who arrived first and who was told to stop. On the 7th day of May, Germany formally surrendered. The fighting stopped almost overnight. Church bells rang across Western Europe. American soldiers celebrated, believing their mission was complete. But for those watching events unfold east of the stop lines, victory felt hollow. The map of Europe now matched the lines Joseph Stalin had demanded months earlier. Soviet forces occupied Berlin, eastern Germany, Poland, and most of Czechoslovakia. The red zone stretched across the heart of the continent. When Harry Truman fully absorbed what had been agreed to at Yalta, his anger was immediate. Briefings revealed the scale of Soviet control. More than a dozen countries, with a population exceeding 100 million people, now fell under Moscow's shadow. Promises of free elections existed only on paper. On the ground, the Soviet secret police were already arresting resistance leaders, dismantling non-communist institutions, and installing loyal regimes. In Poland, the betrayal was swift and unforgiving. Members of the Polish Home Army, who had fought the Germans for years, were summoned for talks and never returned. Some were executed. Others vanished into labor camps. The government in exile was ignored. The country that Britain had gone to war to defend was now firmly in Soviet hands. Across Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the pattern repeated. Soviet troops dismantled factories and shipped machinery east. Political opponents disappeared. Communist parties, once marginal, suddenly held absolute power under Soviet supervision. The occupation was not temporary, it was systematic and permanent. Truman confronted the Soviet foreign minister later in April. He demanded answers about Poland and the promised elections. The tone shocked the Soviet delegation. Roosevelt had never spoken this way. Truman made it clear that American patience was not unlimited. The response was cold. Stalin interpreted the shift as confirmation that the wartime alliance was ending. In response, Soviet consolidation accelerated. While politicians argued, Patton watched the transformation from his headquarters in Germany. Intelligence reports poured in, accounts of mass deportations, widespread violence, entire populations uprooted. American prisoners liberated from German camps described mistreatment at the hands of Soviet forces that rivaled or exceeded what they had endured under the Nazis. Soviet soldiers looted freely. Officers who protested were beaten or killed. Allies in name only. Patton spoke openly to his staff. Germany, he said, was finished. The real enemy now stood to the east. He believed the United States had a brief window to act while American forces were at peak strength and Soviet armies were exhausted. Once that window closed, it would never reopen. On the day Germany surrendered, Patton met with senior officials and made his case directly. He argued that American and British forces, with full air superiority and intact supply lines, could push Soviet forces back within weeks. The Red Army was overstretched and worn down. The moment to act was now. The response from Washington was unequivocal. The American public wanted peace. Soldiers wanted to go home. Congress was already demanding rapid demobilization. No one wanted another war, least of all against a former ally. Patton's warnings were unwelcome, inconvenient, and politically dangerous. In Britain, Winston Churchill shared Patton's fears. He had warned for months that Soviet expansion would not stop voluntarily. After Germany's surrender, he used a phrase in a private message that would soon echo around the world. An iron curtain, he wrote, was descending across Europe. What lay behind it was unknown, but he feared the worst. Churchill went further. He ordered British military planners to examine the possibility of pushing Soviet forces out of Eastern Europe, while Western armies were still mobilized. The plan assumed immediate action and even contemplated rearming German units. Military analysts concluded the plan was possible, but costly. Churchill sent the idea to Truman. Truman rejected it without hesitation. The United States would not begin another war. The political cost was unimaginable. The moment had passed. For the people living east of the new divide, there was no debate. The change was immediate and physical. Midnight arrests, disappearances, show trials, families torn apart. In Poland alone, millions had already died during the war. Now those who survived watched a new occupation settle in. Czechoslovakia felt the betrayal especially sharply. It had been sacrificed once before the war even began. Now, despite having fought alongside the Allies, it fell again under foreign control. Democracy would not survive there much longer. As the summer of 1945 approached, Patton's frustration became public. He spoke to reporters, warning that the Soviet Union posed a greater long-term threat than the defeated Reich ever had. He argued for maintaining a strong military presence in FDR, Europe. He even suggested using German manpower to counter communist expansion. The reaction was swift and hostile. Newspapers portrayed him as reckless. Editorials accused him of seeking another war. His observations from the ground were dismissed. His credibility was questioned. The narrative hardened. Patton was a brilliant battlefield commander who could not adapt to peace. Inside Washington, patience with him wore thin. His outspoken nature embarrassed an administration trying to preserve a fragile relationship with Moscow. When he made a careless remark comparing political parties to the defeated Nazi organization, the backlash was immediate and brutal. The statement was indefensible, but it provided convenient justification. By early autumn, the decision was made. Patton was relieved of command. Officially, it was about discipline and judgment. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. He had become too dangerous because he refused to stay silent. The loudest warning voice in the West was being removed. And with it, the last serious chance to challenge what had already been set in motion. After being removed from command, George Patton found himself sidelined in a Europe he no longer recognized. The war he had devoted his life to winning was over, yet the peace that followed felt like a surrender of a different kind. He remained in Germany, officially tasked with administrative duties, but his influence was gone. The decisions that mattered were now entirely political, and the lines drawn months earlier were hardening into permanent borders. In late autumn of 1945, Patton's life ended suddenly. While traveling near Mannheim, his staff car collided with an army truck. The crash itself was minor by wartime standards, but the consequences were catastrophic. Patton suffered severe spinal injuries that left him paralyzed. Within days, complications set in. In mid-December, he was dead. He was 60 years old. The man who had driven armies across continents was silenced not on the battlefield, but on a quiet German road after the war had already been won. With Patton gone, the warnings stopped coming from anyone with comparable authority. There was no general left who combined battlefield credibility, public visibility, and the willingness to speak plainly about the Soviet threat. Washington found it easier to believe what it wanted to believe. The alliance, officials insisted, could still work. Cooperation was still possible. Time would prove otherwise. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet control hardened into dictatorship. In country after country, communist parties seized total power under Moscow's direction. Opposition leaders disappeared or were imprisoned. Churches were suppressed. Free presses were dismantled. Borders closed. The promise of elections made at Yalta was never honored. Not once. In 1948, the final illusion collapsed when Czechoslovakia's democratic government was overthrown in a communist coup. Shortly afterward, the foreign minister was found dead beneath a window. Authorities claimed it was suicide. No one believed them. The pattern was unmistakable. What had begun as occupation had become permanent rule. Winston Churchill's warning soon became public. In a speech delivered the following year, he spoke openly of an iron curtain dividing Europe. The phrase captured what millions were already living under. On one side, free societies rebuilt. On the other, entire nations were locked behind walls of fear and ideology. The Cold War that followed lasted nearly half a century. It consumed unimaginable resources and fueled conflicts across the globe. Proxy wars erupted in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Millions died far from the conference tables where the original decisions had been made. All of it traced back to a moment when military reality was subordinated to political hope. Whether confronting the Soviet Union in the spring of 1945 would have changed history can never be known. The risks would have been enormous. The cost in lives could have been staggering. But one truth remains undeniable. George Patton saw the threat clearly, while others refused to look. He understood that power unchallenged does not restrain itself. The armies stopped, the maps were honored, the promises were broken, and an entire half of Europe paid the price for 45 years.